Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alana, and this is my corner, my little place on the interwebs where I sit and review books. And today's review, or this week's review rather, is a new release. It was released on October the 18th, 2022. Obviously, yeah. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Barbara Kingsolver is an American author who I think most people recognize her name even if they've never read her books. She wrote the Poisonwood Bible, which I read probably at least a decade ago, and I need to reread because that book lives in my head rent free. But a lot of it I can't remember. I just remember it being a book that kind of stuck with me. Anyway, that's due for a reread. So back in July, I think it was July-ish, Harper Publishing, which is an imprint of HarperCollins, reached out to me and asked if I wanted an arc of this book. It was that was coming out this October. And when I looked at the synopses of it, I didn't recognize, the author's name, but when I looked at the synopses of it, I was like, yes, please and thank you. So I was very fortunate to get an advanced copy of this book, and I read it over the summer. I read it in August and was willing to shift around my TBR for the remainder of the year just to get this book in. And what a book. We're going to dive into this. This review, you're going to notice that I am leaving out all quotes, even though I've annotated this book a decent amount. It has a decent amount of annotations in it. I'm leaving out all quotes in this book, and when I reviewed it and posted it on Instagram, I didn't include quotes just because I have an arc, and technically if you're reviewing from an arc, you don't quote it because this is not the final piece. There are typos and stuff in here, and you don't really know if there haven't been small tweaks or something, that have been made to the text before it's officially published. So all of that aside, this is still a very detailed review. It's one of my longest reviews that I've written in a long time. So we're going to dive into this because this book is going to be a bestseller. And I won't be surprised if in the future this gets put up for awards. It's that good. All right, so let's talk about Demon Copperhead. So as I said, it's by Barbara Kingsolver, who has quite the hefty list of published novels out now. And after this book, I plan to now read all of her published works. And it is a novel that is narrated by Damon, better known as Demon Copperhead. Demon is his nickname. And Copperhead because he has very bright red hair. Damon was born in the mountains of southern Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains, in southwest Virginia. That mountain range spans quite the length of on the eastern coast of the United States. States Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Virginia, up and then down. And he is in southwest Virginia, where he is closer to Tennessee and Kentucky than he is to Virginia's major cities. It is closer for him to go to Tennessee or Kentucky than to go to Virginia Tech, which is in Blacksburg. So that said something. He is out there in the sticks. His family life is tumultuous. His father died before he was born, and his mother is an addict. Kingsolver takes a lot of inspiration from Charles Dickens, which is why it's called Demon Copperhead, and David Copperfield. And because it's a coming of age story that sheds light on the plight of child labor, the opioid crisis in this country, which is still going on, and the foster care system. Damon, I think I did the math. He was really probably born in like 1989 or so. He's definitely a 90s kid, coming of age into adulthood in the early 2000s. And this book also talks about the corrupt pharmaceutical industry, as you can imagine. We're talking about the opioid crisis and how this particular group in Southern Appalachia is often forgotten in the midst of all of this, trying to bring justice and awareness to marginalized groups. This is a group that nobody really cares about. So there's a lot of commentary here. I've heard that Barbara Kingsolver, when it comes to what point and what her point of view is on certain things, she's never shy when it comes to her books. And some people say that she kind of hits the nail over the head. She hits the nail too much, but she will leave you in no doubt what her point of view is. So this book opens right with Damon recounting how he was born in a very specific way. And he narrates the whole book. It's in his voice. And the way that he is born and how he comes into this world, Kingsolver is blatantly making the point that his odd and unique way of coming and being birthed into the world symbolizes his character and how he will pretty much spend his life fighting against the odds. He has a young life that is a constant uphill battle, and yet Damon is a character that completely refuses to fully be defeated by his circumstances. Even when his circumstances get very, very dire, there's always something about this character who is just never going to give into it fully. And you can tell by how he's narrating this story that he does come out on the other side. Because we don't know how old he is when he's narrating his story, but you can tell that he's going to come out of the other end, and that does, at least for me when I read it, and when stuff got pretty dodgy, okay, well, there's this thin line of optimism that's still kind of running throughout the whole narrative. Damon has a very troubled childhood. However, he's in an area in Southern Appalachia where all of his peers almost have troubled childhoods. They are living in these home environments in this community that is riddled with alcohol abuse and drug addicts. The use of hard substances, hard substances, is very common, as well as other types of abuse, using child labor for things, and physical abuse. I will say that if she never recounts any graphic child abuse when it comes to any sexual abuse. She never does that. But it is hinted at from the third person, because Damon may be recalling another peer or another character who he knows of, this person went through X, Y, and Z. So these are children who have been exposed to horrible situations their whole life. And they have been exposed to probably more than most people, your normal person, will be exposed to in their lifetime. Side note, I believe Barbara Kingsolver is from this part of the country. That I did not know until after I read the book. So this location is probably very, very significant and dear to her heart, which is probably, in hindsight, when I think about it, you can tell by the way she writes about this area. However, that doesn't mean that these characters, and especially Damon, don't enjoy the regular, comforts of childhood, playing outside and having friends. And there are these little sprinkles of childhood joys that are in this book. But overall, this is a childhood that is overshadowed by the hard realities of life. And because they grew up this way, Damon and his peers are constantly aware of just how hard and difficult life can be. This book, as I kind of hinted at in the earlier synopsis, really goes into the corruption, or how corrupt institutions and systems are. We're going to talk about the foster care system, the pharmaceutical industry. Because Damon, because he was born into a household that was abusive, his mother was an addict, he has a stepfather that is just horrendous, he eventually ends up in the foster care system. And just like many other youth that we come across in this book that Damon becomes friends with, it's assumed that when a child is put in foster care because their regular home life with their biological parents or whomever or family is just not a good environment, they put them in the foster care system, assuming that that's going to be a better environment. But in this book, Barbara Kingsolver really shows how that's often not the case. The foster care system, or these foster homes, are sometimes not even any better. They're still abused, mistreated, not properly fed and clothed. They're used for child labor. He spends his some part of his childhood on a foster home with a few other boys, working a farm in these horrible conditions, and how they're treated less than by their foster families because they're not biological children. And these families, in this book in particular, take on these foster children because they're getting a check from the government for taking care of these children, and that check is supposed to be used for their care, but these families are using it for their own purposes. And so Damon is constantly put in and out of these homes that don't really want him. They're using him for the check. He's mistreated, and so he's never really had a proper home in the foster care system that really cares and loves him. There is kind of an exception, but I don't want to spoil anything. So, and because he's in this foster care system, he's also dealing with social workers. And Damon, especially when he's recounting his age in his single digits, he even at a young age, he noticed that he didn't get good social workers. He has one very young social worker. She was decent, but she leaves the job for a better employment opportunity to make more money because she just cannot make ends meet properly as a social worker. And so how are you going to get good care for these children when the foster care system is not providing an adequate living for the people who are part of that foster care system on the other end, such as the social workers? They're overworked and severely underpaid. And so Damon still sees it as these social workers who are just overworked, tired, don't really seem to take that much of an interest in the actual conditions that he's in. They kind of turn a blind eye to it. It still leaves him feeling unwanted. So he just feels unwanted in every layer of life. And so there are certain moments in the book, though, where certain characters are just unconditionally kind to him. And those, to me, were actually some of the best parts of the book. There is a gift that somebody gives him, and it's just heartwarming. So yes, you get these elements of the book. The whole book is really kind of melancholy, but you get these elements in the book, and Barbara Kingsolver puts these little situations in and interactions where she lightens the mood right when it needs to be lightened. We're going to switch gears. We're still talking about the system and corrupt systems, but I will say, going into the next topic, I'm talking about farmland, because this takes place in rural southern Appalachia in the middle of nowhere. And so this is an area that heavily relies on farming and mining. And that made me think of Grapes of Wrath, which I will be reviewing soon. And I read before reading this book. And it just so happened that there's a lot of overlap that I was not anticipating, but was very, very, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. So why this reminds me about Grapes of Wrath, this heavily reminded me of Grapes of Wrath, even though it's really inspired by David Copperfield. Like I said, this area, ton of farmland, and there is still some farming, but it's not as lucrative as it used to be because the government and other agencies, if you will, have come in and purchased that land. So that land, some of that land, she even mentions in here, is sold to China, which is actually happening all over the United States. Side note, it should be alarming, I think, to people that there are other countries that are not necessarily considered friends of this country that own pieces of our country. There is a phone call. I think it should be alarming to people that there are other countries that are not necessarily friends of your country, our country, whatever, wherever you live, that are going in and buying up land. Weird. It's just something to think about. And so it's buying up these families who have been there for generations and have lived off the land and worked the land and owned the land and made money off that land to provide for their needs. As you know, it's considered our right in this country. We have a Bill of Rights in which you have the right to property, so they say. but it's being purchased, and it leaves these people without a means to, make living. And in Grapes of Wrath, let me backtrack, because also this is an area that heavily relied on mining, and that's just not in Southwest Virginia, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio. West Virginia in particular was known for their mining communities, and so the mines got shut down. They get purchased. They close the mines, and it leaves whole communities destitute. And because at the time when they were good for mining, these were a class of people who was like, they were laborers in a way, but mining at one point was extremely lucrative. So you may not necessarily need to go to school. You know that you can go into an industry that is going to meet your needs and then some. And that happens in Grapes of Wrath, where you have the government or companies coming in and purchasing farmland, forcing families out of their homes, and then in a sense, they're destitute. So, and they have nowhere else to go, or then they don't know what else to do. This is a community. Damon comes from a community that is just beat down, and they're tired. And so funds are no longer being funneled into this area. The government and other entities have purchased up what were their money makers that could support them. And what they do fund and funnel back into the community are drugs and pharmaceuticals. So they're willing to take away all your means and then pump things in that are going to harm you, helping to keep you oppressed, right? That is real oppression. And so they take away their means to live and funnel in painkillers and opioids that are being overprescribed. And because you have a lot of people in this area who are on Medicaid and disability, they can get these opioids for cheap. I mean, like $1. I'm not even kidding. That's how cheap they are. Once disability and Medicaid and whatever insurance they have, it's just $1 for them out of pocket. I believe she actually quotes that. And at this time period, it was like $1. And so this community, Damon's community, he's growing up in an area that is so drug-ridden. Drug overdoses are normal, and death by overdose is sad, but it's not abnormal. This is a way of life. And Damon does go into a lot of detail about his community and how opioids in the pharmaceutical industry has really destroyed generations of families and just destroyed an entire community. And how this impacts him personally. And Damon himself will struggle with addiction. And it's heartbreaking. But Barbara Kingsolver, again, with Damon, shows how that can be overcome. And it's just excellently done. So Damon also lives in an area where most people that are born there or who are born there stay there. They are not considered well-traveled. And so Kingsolver uses Damon to contrast the difference between urban and rural living. Damon cannot understand why people want to live in cities. They're dirty, they're loud, they're full of people, it's crime-ridden. You look out of your house or your apartment and you see the brick or you see the wall or the outside of your neighbor. You have very little land. People are more materialistically driven. There's no nature. There's less personal space. And he's just like, why would you want to live in that type of environment? Damon and those in his community would be considered uncultured. She even talks about the accents, how they would have what we consider Southern country accents. And there are some of those colloquialisms in here. You can tell when I say this is narrated in Damon's voice, it is narrated in his voice. He is colloquially speaking. That is the narration. Even when there's no dialogue, everything is in his voice. And It's funny because in today's world of everybody Instagramming when they're traveling and going to beautiful places and people looking down on you if you've never been to certain places or left your country, Damon is considered uncultured, which is a shame. I mean, life experience has nothing to do with certain things, okay? It's just a way for people to humble brag and be snobs. Let's call it what it is. Not always, but when people, you know what I'm talking about, those people on social media who just let me show you what I'm doing because I'm better than you. Yeah. Damon would be looked down on by those people, even though he has been through hell and back. He's not well traveled. And Kingsolver is really showing how Damon, living where he has lived and grown up, having this appreciation for where he comes from and the natural beauty that's around him, that is the true meaning of life. That's the essence of life, and that is what makes a life rich. Damon loves his area where he comes from. There are so many beautiful descriptive passages of Southern Appalachia throughout the seasons, the winter, the autumns, the springs, the summers. It is a love letter. Those descriptions are a love letter to Southern Appalachia. And it shows just how beautiful that area is naturally in the richness that is there and should be appreciated. Do me a favor. Google Southern Appalachia. Gorgeous. When I was young, over 10 years ago, younger, and I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go to school for university, I visited a school in, I guess, upper central Northern Virginia-ish. It's Northern Virginia-ish. And on the way back from visiting the school, I did not go. I decided not to pick that school. I didn't even apply. It just wasn't for me. But I remember my dad wanting to take part of the journey, the road back, the drive back through part of the Appalachian Trail. And it was autumn. Stunning. Gorgeous. So yes, do yourself a favor. Google it. It's beautiful. Although Kingsolver does not romanticize the issues that are plaguing this area, she still shines light again on the natural wealth that's there to show people that this region is not less than. It's just, I am raving about this book, okay? Just do yourself a favor. I'm not even done yet. Go read it. Also, Kingsolver uses Damon's voice to challenge the stereotype of his community and people who are from these regions, not just Southern Appalachia in Southwest Virginia, but I think this can be related to people who live in Southern Ohio, West Virginia, Southern Kentucky, all of those areas that were mining communities that are now desolate and often looked down on. Damon talks about the origins of where the word redneck came from and how it's actually a positive thing. I'm going to, if you decide to read it, I'll let you figure that out for yourself because I didn't even know that. It's now associated with like Confederates and all that stuff, but actually this, the term redneck, I just told you to read it for yourself and I'm about to spoil it. This was a group of people who were actually anti-Confederate. Who knew? Anti-Confederacy. And so Damon reclaims that word and claims it as a positive thing. And he specifically talks about how rappers and hip hop artists have reclaimed certain slurs and reused them as a way to gain power back. And Damon is doing the same thing with the word redneck. Because he's like, if he can do it, why can't I? Damon is also an artist. He draws and he has he has a talent for drawing and sketching. And he uses his art to also reclaim the term hillbilly. And it's just, I love the way that Kingsolver is not shy about addressing this issue, especially in 2022. Bold, and I'm here for it. I love a bold author. My girl. And Damon, throughout the whole narrative, calls out how this is a group of people, joking rednecks, joking hillbillies. It seems to be just acceptable. And he says, we see you. We can see you when you joke us on Comedy Central and on TV and in skits and stuff. We are people and we see it and we don't like it. And the hypocrisy is called out because he says, if you did, basically he's saying, if you did this to other marginalized groups, you would be considered racist, or you would be considered this, or you would be considered phobic. But it's okay if it's us. How is that fair? That's basically what Kingsolver is getting at. And she's using Damon's voice to do that. I adored this book. This book, if Harper hadn't reached out to me, I would have probably not been as aware of it, or I would have not read it as soon. And it piqued my interest. I knew by the synopses of it when they reached out to me. I was like, oh, that sounds like my kind of book. I like books that are challenging and challenge narratives and go into those dark recesses of society that are uncomfortable or maybe not socially accessible to talk about, or let's be frank enough, woke enough to talk about. It does challenge some narratives. And I was like, I'm all about that life. But what I was not expecting was for this to end up being a top read of the year. This may be in the top 3. We shall see. I have to get through War and Peace first. But this right now is sitting in the number 2 spot as of this video. Because the voice and the tone of this novel is just so believable. Damon is an authentic character. He is probably my favorite character thus far of the year. That is new to me. I'm not counting Jane Eyre because I've read that 4 times, but he's probably my favorite new character to me of the year. I rooted for him from the first page to the last. This book is unapologetic. It's raw. It's honest. It's gritty. It's well written. And Kingsolver does a good job, again, writing the voice of a young man. And how he uses his own and in his colloquial speech, which makes sense if Barbara Kingsolver was from that area. She's going to be able to nail it. And though I was not a fan of Catcher in the Rye, I hate Catcher in the Rye. That's one of my most hated books of all time. I hate that book. I know that people love Catcher in the Rye. I've read it twice. I had to reread it for a sign. This is about to turn into a Catcher in the Rye rant. Bear with me. Catcher in the Rye, I had to read it in the 8th grade. It was like, what am I reading? Throw it away. A few years ago, maybe, was it a few years ago? Maybe about 2.5 years ago now. I reread it to give it a second chance. Hated it even more. That character is annoying. I cannot relate. I'm like, he has his whole life handed to him on a silver platter, and he blows it and complains the whole time. I get it. He's teenage angst. I get it. But I cannot, he was annoying. And, he had some troubled issues in his life, family life, but he is just such a whiner. And you have a character here who, with a very similar tone, speaking in the voice, his natural voice, using his own slang and colloquialisms, who really has been handed the shortest stick. And he makes no excuses for himself. And he pulls himself up by his bootstraps because nobody else will. I mean, if Catcher in the Rye worked for you, this book will work for you. Catcher in the Rye did not work for me. This worked for me because you have a character who takes control of his own life and stops complaining about certain things and just sees himself honestly and adjusts accordingly. This is a character who actually has character development. Okay. But yes, it's very reminiscent of Catcher in the Rye. When I read this book, there was a point where at page 112 of my edition of the ARC, that was when I was officially hooked. Whenever you're reading a book, a new author, a new book or whatever, it can take a little bit of time to kind of get into the groove of the book. I always say that the book dictates how to read it, the pace in which you read it. By page 112, it was compulsively readable. And I just couldn't put it down. I didn't want to put it down. I could get through big chunks at a time. And when the book ended, first of all, the end could not have been more perfect. And when it ended, I was immediately sad that it was over. And I'm not a hugely emotional reader, but I choked up a little bit. I did. It was just the perfect ending. And I immediately missed this character, and I still miss this character. um, it's an unexpected top read of the year. Right now it's sitting in number 2. I love it when I get to I pick up a book or a book comes my way that I was not anticipating and um, ends up being that much of a standout. If you are a fan of David Copperfield, you will enjoy this book because a lot of the themes are the same. If you liked Catcher in the Rye, if you didn't like Catcher in the Rye, I think you would like this. If you liked Grapes of Wrath and the themes that it talks about in that book about how the little man gets crushed by the big man, you will really like this. I think also if you're a fan of A Little Life, you will like this. Is it as graphic as Little Life? Not at all. Is it as honest and blunt as Little Life? Yes, but it is not as graphic as A Little Life. And I think that if A Little Life, you wanted to read it, but maybe you just like, I just don't want to read certain, look at, this is what happens with freshly washed hair. Maybe if you're interested in certain themes in A Little Life, but maybe A Little Life is too much. I think that the content is stepped down from A Little Life. But I think there's some interesting crossover there. Crossover, especially when it comes to children, youth who grew up in really, really troubled environments. Obviously, this was a 5 out of 5 for me. In the top 3, currently sitting at top 2. Pretty much by the time this review comes up, gets posted, it may have only been out for a month or so. Do yourself a favor. Pick it up. Thank you, Harper Publishing, for sending this my way. This book is phenomenal. Highly, highly recommend. Is this book on your radar? Did you know it was going to be released? Do you now plan on reading it? Does it sound intriguing to you? Do you plan on picking it up, etc., etc.? Let me know. Thank you for sitting with me, taking time out of your day, however you want to say it, for listening to this video, watching this video. After this review, I will be posting my end of the year tag. So I will go over what my reading plans are for the remainder of the year. Then after that, I've got more reviews coming up. I will see you. Oh, and there will probably be a smaller book haul before the end of the year because I'm already gearing up for 2023 reading and filling in my shelves with the books that I don't have, but that I will be reading next year. All of my links are down below. Please feel free to follow me on Instagram, where I have the rest of my bookish content, if not more bookish content. And feel free to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.